Ndị be anyị ndewonu. Ọ bụ Ada Igbo na-ekwu na Igbo Media. N'Igbo Media, anyị na-ewetara unu ọtụtụ ozi gbasara ihe na-emegasị na Biafra Land, n'ala Igbo na mba ndị ọzọ. N'ụbọchị nke taata, o nwere ihe bịara n'iru akwụkwọ anyị nke anyị ga-agụpụtara unu n'ụbọchị taa. Anyị gụpụtachaa ya, unu egee ya ka ọha n'uju. Ị ga-esie ya, ị drọpụọla your comment, like kwa this our video and gbasakwa ya ka o ruo ụmụnna anyị n'ebe dị iche iche arụ. Ozi anyị wetara unu tata si n'aka otu nwanne anyị nwoke, a Biafra activist. Dịka o si wetara anyị ozi a n'iru akwụkwọ, ọ dere sị: Breaking news: Finland government blows hot, warns African Union over PM Simon Ekpa as release order gain momentum. Ya bụ ozi ka anyị ji bịa tata na Igbo Media. Ị ga-esi ya bụ ozi, gbaa mbọ gwa anyị iche ma mekwa ka ozi arute ụmụnna anyị n'ebe dị iche iche aka. Ngwa gere ya ka ọha n'uju.
Leaders demanding justice and fairness. After weeks of strong statements from African capitals and mounting calls from civil society groups across the continent, Finnish authorities have begun reassessing the situation surrounding Simon Ekpa', the Biafran activist whose name has drawn attention both within and beyond Africa. According to official diplomatic sources, the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs has opened formal consultations with representatives of the African Union mission to the European Union in Brussels. These discussions focus on addressing what many African leaders describe as the unjust treatment of African voices calling for self-determination. The message from Africa has been firm, unified, and consistent. Simon Ekpa' and Mazi Nnamdi Kanu are not criminals. They are individuals advocating for freedom and justice, values recognized under both the United Nations Charter and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The turning point came after an extraordinary African Union session in Addis Ababa, where several heads of state, notably Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, and President William Ruto of Kenya, made a collective declaration urging Finland to release Simon Ekpa' and reaffirming Africa's moral responsibility to defend its own citizens abroad. The AU communiqué emphasized that Africa could no longer remain silent while legitimate demands for justice were met with restrictions or persecution. The joint statement delivered by the AU's diplomatic envoy to Helsinki was clear and uncompromising. It read, "The African Union stands in solidarity with its sons and daughters who seek peaceful means to express their right to self-determination. The detention or restriction of Simon Ekpa' undermines international law and contradicts Finland's long-standing image as a defender of freedom and democracy." This diplomatic message carried the weight of an entire continent. Finland, a country that prides itself on human rights and fairness, could not ignore the voice of the African Union, especially when the call was supported by multiple African governments and echoed by their citizens across social media, local assemblies, and global advocacy groups. Soon after the AU's official message reached Helsinki, a senior Finnish Foreign Ministry spokesperson confirmed that Finland had received Africa's concerns with respect and seriousness. The spokesperson further explained that the government was reviewing the matter in the light of international human rights standards, and acknowledged that Finland values its long-standing partnership with Africa. This diplomatic response, though measured, marked a major shift. For years, many African activists living abroad had felt ignored or dismissed by European governments when they raised political issues related to Africa. But this time, the situation was different. Africa was united, confident, and determined to protect one of its own. Inside Finland, human rights organizations began to support the African position. Groups such as the Finnish League for Human Rights and Amnesty International Finland publicly called for transparency and fairness in Simon Ekpa''s case. They argued that no individual should face legal or political persecution for advocating peace, freedom, or the rights of his people. Their statements added moral pressure on the Finnish government to act in line with its international commitments. In Africa, the reaction to Finland's willingness to listen was immediate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré described it as a new chapter in African diplomacy. He stated that the era of ignoring African concerns was over and that every African leader now has a duty to stand up for the dignity of Africans everywhere. President Ramaphosa echoed this sentiment, saying that the African Union's unity had finally proven that Africa can defend its citizens beyond its borders through diplomacy, not dependency. Meanwhile, President William Ruto emphasized that the case of Simon Ekpa' was not only about one man but about the principle of justice itself. He stated that Finland's responsiveness was a welcome example of international cooperation built on mutual respect. Ruto noted that if the world respects freedom of speech and human rights, then those principles must also apply to Africans without exception. The diplomatic channels between Helsinki and the African Union remain active, with both sides committed to resolving the matter peacefully. Reports from EU diplomatic circles suggest that Finland's government is preparing a formal statement to clarify Simon Ekpa'S legal situation and outline next steps toward a resolution that aligns with human rights law. Observers across Europe and Africa view Finland's openness as a direct result of Africa's firm but respectful diplomatic approach. Unlike past situations where African concerns were fragmented, this effort demonstrated a unified and coordinated strategy, a hallmark of the new Africa that Captain Traore and others have been calling for. At the same time, grassroots support for the cause continues to grow. Across African cities, from Lagos to Nairobi, from Accra to Johannesburg, civil society groups, students, and Pan-African movements have been organizing peaceful demonstrations and online campaigns under hashtags such as #FreeSimonEkpa, #AfricaUnite, and #JusticeForBiafra. These actions have amplified the diplomatic voice of the African Union, sending a clear signal that ordinary Africans are fully behind their leaders' call for justice. Political analysts believe Finland's readiness to respond positively is not just a legal matter but also a symbolic acknowledgement of Africa's growing diplomatic strength. The world is beginning to see Africa not just as a collection of developing nations but as a unified voice capable of influencing international decisions. The message from the African Union remains firm. Simon Ekpa did not commit a crime. He exercised his right to speak for his people and advocate for peaceful self-determination. The AU maintains that such actions fall within the boundaries of international law and that silencing such voices is contrary to the global principles Finland itself upholds. As consultations continue, hopes are high across Africa that Finland's next announcement will confirm Simon Ekpa's full release and restoration of his rights. The African Union's diplomatic success in pushing this agenda has already sent a powerful message across the world, that Africa has found its collective strength, and when it speaks with one voice, even global powers listen. In this new chapter of African diplomacy, Finland's response represents more than just compliance with a request. It symbolizes mutual respect between continents and recognition that African lives, voices, and rights deserve the same level of dignity as anyone else. The unity displayed by the African Union marks a defining moment, one where Africa's silence has finally turned into strength, and its collective voice is now shaping global decisions. Following Finland's diplomatic response and readiness to review Simon Ekpa's case, African leaders have intensified their stance, showing rare unity and determination. Across African capitals, the reaction has been one of approval and renewed purpose. Leaders who once spoke cautiously are now speaking with full conviction. Africa, they say, will no longer allow its people to be silenced or mistreated, whether at home or abroad. At the heart of this movement stands Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, who has emerged as one of the most consistent voices for African self-determination. In a firm statement broadcast from Ouagadougou, Traore declared that Africa's position is not a plea but a demand for respect and justice. He stated that Simon Ekpa and Mazi Namdi Konu have done nothing to deserve detention or restriction, as their struggle represents the legitimate aspirations of millions who want freedom through peaceful means. Traore's words were echoed by South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, who said that the Finnish government's willingness to cooperate with the African Union was a positive step toward global fairness. Ramaphosa stressed that Africa has matured diplomatically and will no longer accept double standards in how freedom and human rights are applied. If freedom of expression and political opinion are protected in Europe, he said, then they must also be respected for Africans who raise their voices for justice. Kenya's President William Ruto reinforced that message during a joint press briefing in Nairobi. He stated that the unity displayed by African nations over Simon Ekpa's case is a reflection of the continent's growing political confidence. Africa is now in a position to stand for its citizens with courage and clarity, Ruto said. We are not opposing any country, but we are reminding the world that fairness must have one standard, not two. Other African leaders have joined in strong support. Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo praised Finland for acknowledging Africa's concerns, saying it shows that diplomacy can achieve what confrontation never could. Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan called the development a breakthrough for African dignity, noting that this could open the door for similar cooperation on other human rights issues. Senegal's President Bassirou Diomaye Faye added that it was time for Africa to create a consistent policy for defending its citizens globally, especially those involved in peaceful activism. In Addis Ababa, the African Union Commission released an updated statement confirming that it would continue to engage with Finland until Simon Ekpa'S release is fully guaranteed. The Commission's spokesperson emphasized that the case is not only about one man but about the principle that Africans should not be punished for demanding their rights peacefully. The spokesperson added that the AU's position is grounded in both international law and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which guarantees the right to self-determination for all peoples. The AU also used this moment to highlight the case of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, calling on Nigeria to act in the same spirit of fairness. In the words of one AU delegate, if Finland can respect Africa's call for justice, then Nigeria must also listen. We cannot call for freedom abroad and ignore the same cry within our own borders. The statement resonated strongly across the continent, drawing wide support from civil society, faith leaders, and youth movements who see this as the beginning of a new moral awakening in Africa. Across African cities, public support for the AU's position continues to grow. Peaceful demonstrations, online campaigns, and community gatherings have become a daily occurrence. Movements like the Pan-African Solidarity Forum, Voices of the Youth for Justice, and Africa Rising Coalition have organized statements and solidarity marches. Their central message is simple: Africa's unity must now translate into action. Political analysts describe this moment as a turning point in Africa's foreign policy identity. For decades, the continent has been seen as divided and reactive. But now, through the unified call for Simon Ekpa'S release, Africa is presenting a new image, one of proactive diplomacy, collective responsibility, and strategic coordination. The involvement of multiple presidents from different regions of the continent, from west to east and south, has made the message impossible to dismiss. In their latest joint communiqué, the leaders reaffirmed 4 key principles. Africa must protect its citizens globally. No African activist or journalist should face unfair treatment abroad for exercising rights recognized under international law. Dialogue, not detention, is the path to peace. Simon Ekpa' and Nnamdi Kanu's cases should be resolved through understanding, not punishment. Self-determination is a human right. Africans have the same right as any other people to discuss their political future peacefully. African unity is non-negotiable. When Africa speaks together, the world must listen. The African Union Peace and Security Council has since held special consultations to coordinate further diplomatic follow-ups. Plans are being made for an AU delegation to visit both Finland and Nigeria, ensuring that the cases of Simon Ekpa' and Nnamdi Kanu are treated in line with international human rights standards. Observers note that the AU's coordinated stance has elevated Africa's global standing. Western governments and international organizations are watching closely, realizing that Africa's influence is growing not through confrontation, but through organized diplomacy. The message is powerful: a united Africa can no longer be ignored in global affairs. Within Finland, government sources reportedly described the AU's tone as measured but firm, noting that it reflected a continent confident in its voice and conscious of its rights. The Finnish government has welcomed the dialogue, acknowledging that mutual respect between Africa and Europe is essential for future cooperation. As these developments unfold, African citizens continue to express pride in the decisive leadership of figures like Traore, Ramaphosa, Ruto, and others who have stood publicly for justice. Across social media and in African media outlets, the phrase "Africa is awake" has become a slogan for the new diplomatic era. This chapter of Africa's involvement in Simon Ekpa'S case is more than political. It is deeply symbolic. It shows a continent learning to speak for itself, united across regions and ideologies, defending its sons with dignity. It also demonstrates a shift in how Africa is perceived internationally, from passive observer to active negotiator. The unity shown by African leaders proves that Africa's power lies in its collective will. The calls for Simon Ekpa'S freedom are not merely about one man's case. They are about setting a standard that will protect every African voice that stands for justice. As Captain Ibrahim Traore said in his final remarks after the AU session, Africa has spoken clearly. We will defend our people wherever they are. Justice for one African is justice for all Africans. This statement captures the new direction Africa has taken: strong, coordinated, and ready to act whenever its people's rights are at stake. The movement that began with a call for Simon Ekpa'S freedom has now become a wider message of unity, pride, and responsibility. With Finland now showing readiness to release Simon Ekpa'S, a new wave of optimism is spreading across Africa and among Biafran
Daalụ rinne maka isonyere anyị n'iru akwụkwọ n'ụbọchị nke taata. Ọ bụrụ na ozi anyị wetara gị dị gị mma, gbaa mbọ gbasaa ya ka o rute ụmụnne anyị n'ebe dị iche iche arụ, ma gwakwa anyị ichere na kọment sekshọn. Ngwa ka ọ dị.